Carolina.
Madam Chair, my bipartisan amendment will allow the to repair and rebuild bases that were badly damaged by recent natural disasters and will restore funding for critical projects aboard the Nuclear Power Training Unit at Joint Base Charleston. Without the additional $270 million my amendment provides, the Air Force has stated that they will need to divert funding from projects across the country to rebuild Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases. This would have disastrous effects on the readiness of our armed forces and on our national security. The operational success of our Navy is dependent on highly trained crews. The NPTU uses real nuclear power plants aboard retired submarines to train sailors to operate and maintain nuclear-powered fleet. And starting this month, the Low Country will be the only place in the nation where sailors can learn these highly technical skills, which are fundamental to our Navy's ability to maintain its worldwide presence and ensure the security of the global commons. That is why it is urgent that we pass this amendment and ensure the NPTU has the resources to modernize and repair its training facilities and ensure that the pipeline of newly trained nuclear operators is not disrupted. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina reserves his time. Is there a member that seeks time in opposition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek the floor?
Claim the time in opposition, although I do not oppose the amendment.
Without objection.
Now, Chair, I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. We are still waiting for a final damage assessment, and we understand that the Air Force has adjusted its original fiscal assessment. The underlying bill includes $400 million for the airport. The Cunningham Amendment will increase the amount to a total of $670. The need for additional funding is acute. I have two of my colleagues also speak on that need. I would simply point out that I deeply regret at this late date that the administration still has not made official requests to fund the needs of both the Air Force and the Marines in the recovery from the last fall's hurricane. Absent a comprehensive request, the funds necessary to address the extensive damage for these key installations will be provided in an inefficient and piecemeal fashion. I would urge the administration, and particularly the Office of Management and Budget and the Secretary of Defense, to finally send a full and detailed cost assessment to Congress and properly prioritize the rebuilding of these installations. I would be happy to recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, our colleague, Mr. Forbury.
For how much time does the gentleman yield?
1.5 minutes, as I understand.
That would be helpful.
Please.
The gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me thank Chairman Visklosky for the time and for his efforts here, as well as the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham, for offering this very important amendment to the bill. Madam Chair, it's pretty jarring when you stand in your district at a major piece of America's military infrastructure, Offutt Air Force Base, and it's a third underwater. Offutt Air Force Base is also home to Strategic Command, which is the command that is in charge of our nuclear enterprise here and around the world. In March of this year, a furious slurry of soil and water and ice rushed down the Platte and Elkhorn rivers. It crossed over the Missouri, hit the Iowa levee, blew it out, dug a 62-foot hole, and then water began to come back up the Missouri River. Offutt Air Force Base sits at the confluence of the Missouri rivers, and this is what forced the flooding. I'm very grateful again to my colleagues for recognizing that this is a disaster that needs national attention, along with the other natural disasters that have hit our country, particularly Tyndall Air Force Base as well. This amendment provides the funds to the Air Force operations and maintenance accounts to rebuild essential military infrastructure in my district and around the country. It will help us rebuild hangars and other buildings at Offutt, and this is in dire need. I'm pleased that my colleagues have recognized that this package, $120 million of which could potentially go to Offutt, is also essential for helping our nation rebound from the various natural disasters that have hit us. I yield back.
And I would be happy at this time to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Bacon from Nebraska.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the bipartisan work here to support our bases that need to be rebuilt. Now, I rise in support of this amendment to increase the Air Force O&M budget in the disaster aid package to a total of $670 million for recovery of the military bases that sustained extensive damage by the recent storms. In March, my district in the home state of Nebraska experienced devastating floods where lives were lost and the scale of destruction made it the worst natural disaster in our 152-year history as a state. The damage to Nebraska's infrastructure, agriculture, and local economy is extensive. It includes Offutt Air Force Base, one of the 2 largest employers in our local area. At the height of the storm, 1/3 of the base was underwater. 3,000 people were displaced from their work centers, and 1.2 million square feet of mission space was lost. The flight line was inoperable, with 1/3 of the runway underwater. Many structures incurred significant damage, and critical systems were destroyed. Our nation owes a debt of gratitude to those men and women at Offutt that worked relentlessly to save what they could. The mission impact and cost to taxpayers would have been worse without efforts. So I'm very grateful for the bipartisan leadership here and the teamwork by Representatives Cunningham, Fortenberry, Dunn, and so many others to make this reality. You know, Offutt's one of the 2 primary intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance hubs in our country, and it's the home of STRATCOM, so it's vital that we get this done. With that, I yield back, and I just thank you for yielding, and we need to support this amendment. Thank you.
And would yield back my time.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn.
I thank you, Congressman
Gentleman's
Cunningham.
recognized.
Madam Chair, I rise today because the United States Air Force is in desperate need of our help. I'm proud to co-sponsor this amendment that raises the Air Force funding levels for fiscal year 19. Our amendment, brings the operations and maintenance account up to $670 million, which is the minimum the Air Force needs to continue to rebuild Offutt and Tyndall Air Force bases. On October 10th, Tyndall, in my district, took a direct hit from Category 5 Michael. Now, 7 months later, no supplemental funding has been provided. That is irresponsible. On May 1st, Secretary Wilson was forced to halt all work rebuilding Tyndall due to lack of funds. This is a severe blow to our nation's military readiness. These bases are critical to our nation's defense for both combat and training missions, and some of the missions literally cannot be duplicated anywhere else in the world. Madam Chair, our ability to defend America is suffering. My district and many other districts across our nation are suffering from hurricanes, fires, and floods, and I urge a yes vote on the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Then the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Madam Chair, I just want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Dunn, Mr. Fortenberry, and Mr. Bacon for their commitment to the men and women of our armed forces, and for joining me in offering this bipartisan amendment. And I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in favor of this bipartisan, common sense amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.